Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're tackling a really fundamental question, but we're kind of flipping the script on it. We're moving past the usual headlines about national security, military stuff. We want to ask, whose security are we actually talking about here? We're going deep on human security, looking at safety at the individual level.
Yeah, and if you trace back this idea, human security, or HS, it's really about fundamentally changing how we think about being safe. It's not so much about, state borders. It's about the threats people face in fulfilling, well, basic values in their actual lives. This whole concept got a huge boost from the UN's 1994 Human Development Report. It really put pressure on shifting focus towards ordinary people, not just state defense.
Okay, so our mission today is to wade through the, let's face it, inevitable academic debates around this and pull out the real nuggets of knowledge. What defines security for you today? We've got sources that lay out the basics, explore this tension between keeping the definition broad versus narrowing it down, and then importantly, we'll look at how this plays out in real-world conflict zones today, specifically Sudan and Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa. Right, let's start with the original framework. That 1994 report didn't just throw the term out there, did it? It gave specifics.
No, it was quite structured. It laid out this checklist, basically, of 7 dimensions of human security. You had economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political security. The goal was a kind of map, to make sure policymakers weren't missing those quieter threats that still really impact people's lives and dignity.
That sounds incredibly broad. 7 categories covering almost everything. But looking at the analysis, the real power isn't just listing those things off, is it?
No, exactly. It's about the connections between them. The real value add is that HS acts as a boundary concept. It kind of forces everyone, policymakers, analysts, to look beyond their usual silos. You can't just think about health without considering economics or the environment. It pushes for a more holistic view. So the most important threat gets attention no matter which box it seems to fit in initially.
Okay, that makes sense, seeing the whole system. But almost immediately, there was this pushback, wasn't there? Pressure to shrink that big definition.
Sure.
It's interesting that some people argued human security should only mean personal security, mostly focusing on, physical violence.
Yeah, that's where you see the policy tension bubble up. The argument was, well, we already have agencies dealing with economic issues, health, politics.
Yeah.
So the thinking went, HS should focus its unique energy on physical safety, on violence, because that's maybe the bit that falls through the cracks. But importantly, the original 1994 definition of personal security was actually much wider than just freedom from violence.
Oh, really? How so? What did personal security originally include back in '94?
Well, it was pretty sprawling itself. It covered, yes, physical violence, but also other crimes against life and property, accidents, abuse, even neglect. It wasn't just about war. And, crucially, it was understood to be deeply linked to psychological security.
The psychological aspect. Feeling safe, having dignity, that feels fundamental. So the original vision was quite holistic: abuse, accidents, mental well-being. But the policy world kind of wanted to boil it down to just don't get physically attacked. That really shows the challenge.
It really does. And that psychological part, the feeling of safety, leads us right into another related idea: citizen security. This popped up a lot in places like Latin America and Spain, especially after they moved away from authoritarian rule. It focused on things like police reform, rule of law, tackling everyday crime.
And this is where we get that crucial distinction, right? The difference between objective safety, the actual statistics, and subjective safety, how safe people feel.
Exactly. The definition used in Costa Rica's Human Development Report back in 2005 nailed it. They called citizen security, quote, the personal, objective, and subjective condition of being free from violence or from the threat of intentional violence or dispossession by others. You need both. If you only reduce crime stats but people still live in fear, have you really improved security? Probably not entirely.
So if that subjective fear is what really drives how people behave, does that mean just focusing on lowering crime rates might not be enough if folks still feel terrified?
It's a massive challenge, and sometimes those feelings are completely disconnected from the facts on the ground.
Yeah.
That same Costa Rican report had this really startling finding. The perceived frequency of some crimes, it was up to 8 times higher than the actual estimated rate.
8 times. Wow. That gap is huge. It really highlights how fear itself is a factor. If people felt that unsafe when crime was relatively low, it's hard to even imagine the level of subjective fear in a place like Khartoum right now, where personal security is just collapsed. It makes understanding those misperceptions of fear seem important, but also tragically abstract when the objective reality is that terrifying. Okay, let's pivot to that reality now. Let's use this framework to look at extreme failures of personal security, starting with the conflict in Sudan between the SF and the RSF.
Yes, this is just a devastating example of total personal security breakdown. Our sources paint a picture of widespread, pervasive sexual violence. It's primarily linked to the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, but there's documentation of the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SF, being involved too. The accounts are horrific. Rape, gang rape, one report documented over 74 incidents just between May and November. Sexual violence against people held captive, which might even be sexual slavery. And cases of rape deliberately carried out in front of family members. It's used as a weapon.
And the victims aren't just women, right? The age range is shocking, and it includes men and boys, too. This sounds systematic, not random.
Absolutely systematic. And this complete breakdown feeds into other abuses that destroy community and economic security, too. You see the RSF forcing women and girls into marriage, sometimes forced child marriage, sometimes desperate families agree, maybe thinking it offers some kind of twisted protection, or just out of sheer economic survival. And with the education system shattered, over 19 million kids out of school, girls become incredibly vulnerable to this.
So it's a cascade failure. It's not just personal security collapsing. The warring parties are actually making it worse by blocking help for survivors. That hits the health security dimension hard, too.
Precisely. And that's why that original boundary concept idea is so powerful you can't separate these things. Since late 2023, the SAF has effectively blockaded aid, including vital medical supplies, from getting into RSF areas in Khartoum. At the same time, the RSF is looting supplies, taking over hospitals, using homes as bases. It's a double blow.
The scale of that obstruction, preventing care for people who've endured such trauma, it really brings those 7 dimensions to life in the worst possible way. The consequences must be devastating.
They are. Survivors are dealing with terrible physical injuries, sometimes dying from lack of care. There are at least 4 documented deaths linked to this. And even if someone can get to a medical facility, the legal system itself is another barrier.
So they're trapped by injury, by law, by the conflict itself. Just awful. Okay, let's shift perspective slightly, still in the Horn of Africa, but to a different kind of security challenge, the tension between counterterrorism and human rights in Ethiopia. We know the region is unstable, a potential breeding ground for groups like Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, and others.
Right, and Ethiopia's main response to this was their 2009 Anti-Terrorism Proclamation, the ATP. It was aimed at both external groups like Al-Shabaab and internal threats. Ethiopia defends this law by pointing to the state's duty to protect citizens. That's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 3. They also highlight their multi-agency approach involving intelligence, the military, ENDF, and federal police.
Okay, but this is where that classic security versus rights dilemma really comes into sharp focus, isn't it? The ATP got a lot of criticism on human rights grounds.
It did. Critics argue the law seriously undermines due process. They pointed to excessive powers given to security forces. Also, the language used to define a terrorist organization was seen as worryingly vague, and it allowed electronic surveillance, wiretapping, without needing a court warrant first.
And the point that really stood out to me from the sources was about evidence. The law allowed admitting indirect evidence. What does that mean?
It means things like hearsay, rumors, or intelligence reports could be used in court. And the huge concern there is that such information might have been obtained through coercion, potentially even torture.
Wow. If evidence possibly gained through torture can be used, that directly attacks the personal security and dignity of the very citizens the law claims to protect.
Exactly. So you see the core tension laid bare. Yes, counterterrorism demands strong action. But if those actions become so broad, so intrusive, that they trample on basic rights like due process or freedom from torture, then they risk destroying the very freedoms and security they were supposed to safeguard in the first place.
Okay, let's pull these threads together. We started with this big 7-part idea of human security. Then we saw how it immediately faced pressure to narrow down, maybe just focus on violence, on personal security.
But what our deep dive suggests, I think, is that the real strength of the human security idea isn't about picking one narrow focus. It's about its flexibility. It's not about rigidly sticking to the 7 boxes. It's the capacity to shift focus, to do that wide scan, looking at everything from economics to health to crime, mapping all the threats, and then doing an intensive focus, zeroing in on what's most critical in a specific time and place, whether that's the horrific sexual violence in Sudan or the risks of legal overreach in Ethiopia's counterterrorism.
So it's the ability to see the whole person, their entire context of threats and dignity, not just viewing security through the lens of the state or the military budget.
Precisely. And that leaves us and you, the listener, with the final thought to chew on, connecting back to that objective versus subjective security point. We saw how fear often shapes our actions and policies more than hard data. So thinking about the chaos in Sudan or the surveillance worries in Ethiopia, should our main effort be on reducing the actual objective harm? Or should we perhaps put more energy into managing those pervasive subjective feelings of insecurity and fear that really dictate how people experience their lives day to day? Where should the balance lie? That's a really tough but vital question.
A question that definitely connects all these dots. It reminds us security isn't just about events, it's deeply about how people feel. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Being well informed means connecting these complex pieces.